Welcome to Renegade Thinkers Unite, a show that will help you transform your marketing from mere messaging to programs that break the rules and make a difference. Join the movement today and learn non-traditional techniques that give you an edge. Now, here's your Chief Marketing Renegade, Drew Neisser.
So we have an amazing episode today. We're going to be talking about B2B storytelling. And I have to, of course, start with a story. Right now, I'm actually sort of in the middle of the Civil War. I am listening to a book, A Team of Rivals, Doris Kearns Goodwin's book about Lincoln and his rivals. And I'm reading the Grant, the new Chernow book on Grant. And there's a couple of reasons why I wanted to bring those up. One, Lincoln was a fabulous storyteller. And in fact, it was the secret to his success. And early on in his career, he's a lawyer, and they literally go from circuit to circuit to circuit. And each night after they finish, the judges and the lawyers all get together at a bar, and Lincoln held court and told stories. And he made a network of friends because they could all, it was amazing. It was just genius about remembering them. And by the way, he rehearsed. He practiced. He knew what was a great story. The other part of this that I wanted to point out that's so interesting to me is Ulysses S. Grant, and was not a storyteller except for in a very private setting. He would tell stories with his people that he trusted, but it was very hard for him to build close friendships. He just didn't want to do it. But what's most fascinating about Grant, and as you think about your own secret sauce and what makes you special as an individual, Grant was an incredible general and pretty much bad at everything else, which is amazing, right? Is that here's somebody who was so important. And Lincoln said, I was just heard the stories about him drinking and said, I don't care. Get me a general who can make things happen. So anyway, with that long-winded intro, my guest today is David Aaker, who is vice chair of Profit and a prolific writer, has written 16 books, or 17?
Yeah, who's counting?
Yeah, who's counting? And his latest book is?
It's creating signature stories.
So what could be more appropriate to talk about storytelling than David, who has investigated this topic greatly. If you haven't listened to Alan Hart's show, Marketing Today, he had David as a guest, which inspired me to have a guest. I highly recommend you do it because I see that as the B2C version. This is going to be the B2B version. So let's just start with, why are we all so coming to this point where we're realizing that storytelling is so important for brands and B2B brands in particular?
Well, I think it's because there's a critical strategic message that needs to get out. And that's particularly true to B2B companies because they have a relationship. Their organization has a relationship to their customers. And that means they really need to communicate their organizational values, the brand vision, much more so than B2C companies. And, both internally and externally, employees want to have meaning in their work today. But customers, especially B2B customers, want to have a relationship with an organization that they respect, they admire, they trust. And so that becomes a critical job. Second thing is, it's really hard to do that these days because your audience members, it's so sad, but they don't care about you. They don't care about your firm. They don't care about your brand. They don't care about your offering. They just don't care. They're
not waiting for the messages that we're pushing out at them?
They've got other things to do. They've got other things in their mind. And they're disinterested. They're skeptical. And they're a tough audience. And also the media world is cluttered today. It's really hard. So into this context steps story.
Okay. So let me ask you I want to break that down. I want to go back. Why do we think that story is an effective way of engaging employees?
Well, it's because you really have, two choices. You can give people facts or you can tell stories. And facts simply don't work. Especially when you have a hostile context that I just described, or a difficult context. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of studies that have documented the facts that in comparison to facts, stories get attention, Stories change perceptions. Stories change attitude. Stories inspire. Stories stimulate action. And I'm not talking about 20%, 30% more effective. I'm talking about 200%, 300%. It's just staggering if you look at how futile it is to try to convince people of anything using facts.
I have two thoughts on that. One, there's a famous quote, I think it was William Randolph Hearst, which said, "Don't let the facts get in the way of a good story," which I love. And of course, that reminded me of a recent State of the Union address, which actually featured a lot of stories as a way of, 12 stories of individuals as a way of communicating the broader message. So clearly the story about storytelling has gotten made it up to the presidency.
But I have a friend that runs a very large nonprofit, and she just put out a annual statement of all her programs. It was very dense, and there was not one story in it. And she has these dramatic stories she could have put in there, and she didn't. So why is that? And why do B2B people insist on talking about product specifications? And it's because first of all, they have this terrible, erroneous notion that their customers are logical and rational, want to know facts. But even beyond that, they've got this, they develop these communication objectives. They say, what do we want them to know? And it's a list of, 4 to 7 facts. And so what would you do with that charge? Well, you put out the 4 to 7 facts. You don't look for a story because, first of all, it's hard to find a story that communicates even 1 or 2 of those facts well. No story will communicate them all well. And so it just is inefficient and it's troublesome. And so and besides, why would you do that if customers are rational? And so there's a great bias toward delivering facts.
I think if I was the CMO and a bunch of marketers from B2B, they'd say, you know what? We have people checking out our spec sheets and our comparison sheets, and they're comparing our product versus the other. They're very interested in the price and the functionality. Why do you think that facts are kind of useless in this process?
Well, for 2 reasons. One is that facts just don't work. They don't break through the clutter. They don't break through these disinterested and skeptical audience members. They just don't work. But beyond that, even if they did work from a communication sense, the reality is that that's not why people select one brand over another. It's because of a relationship, and a good part of the relationship in a B2B context is what you think of the organization as opposed to the offering. Do you think the organization will deliver consistent quality? Do you think the organization cares? Are the organization nice people? Do you admire them? Do you respect them? And at the end of the day, you can have a sheet of specs and proposals that are 2 feet high, and at the end of the day, they'll make decisions on their gut feel of what this organization is about.
Is that often these decisions come down to I just like them better.
Yep.
And particularly in B2B services choices, they just like them better. Okay. You mentioned earlier that stories are important to employees and the story that the company tells about itself, as well as, I imagine, the internal use of stories. Again, in the B2B environment, you don't see a lot of that. So what is it going to take to sort of get these B2B firms to sort of recognize that story is a cultural opportunity?
Well, let me tell you a story.
Oh, good.
In 1984, in China, a young manager took over a failing appliance company. And during his first few weeks on the job, a customer came in with a defective appliance, and he went to the warehouse with his customer to get a replacement. And he found that 20% or 72 of the appliances in that warehouse were defective. He took those 72 into the floor of the production area, and he had his employees destroy them with a sledgehammer. Now, you could, and he said, from now on, quality is what we're about. And that company, incidentally, is now named Aaker. It's the largest appliance manufacturer in the world. But that sledgehammer is still around. They still talk about the sledgehammer for the employees, the dealers, and others. And you could talk about quality. You could talk about a quality program. You could say we redesign our appliances to be more quality. We've now got quality control that's better, and we changed our culture. We changed our priorities, and nobody's going to believe that. Nobody's going to remember that. But you tell them the sledgehammer story, and that really is something you do remember. You do talk about, and you have the symbol of the sledgehammer. All you have to do is mention that, and the story comes back, and the quality implications around it.
Yeah, I think it's a great, what's interesting about that story is it is very much of an internal story, and one that would be motivating and sort of speaks to a cultural commitment. So, all right, let's take a quick break, and then when we come back, we'll talk a lot more about some specific examples of B2B storytelling where we saw, brands really saw transformation.
Hey, it's Drew. I was at a conference the other day and somebody looked at my saw lapel pen and said, "What's up with that?" And I said, "Well, what's the one thing that marketing has always had to do? Forget digital, forget all this stuff. What is the one marketing imperative?" And he looked at me and went, "Cut through." And I went, "Yes, ding, 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 ding. That's right. Cut through. That is what marketing must do." And it's not just cutting through the clutter, although that's really important, because if your marketing doesn't cut through the clutter, it's like the proverbial tree in the forest that falls and nobody hears it. But it's also cutting through the crap and the processes that inhibit innovation. We've been working a lot lately with some CMOs to help them cut through the crap and get at the essence of what is their big idea. And how can they make a case to expand that idea across their business? That, to me, is cutting through.
Okay, we're back, and my guest is David Aaker, the Vice Chair of Profit. And we've been talking about the power of storytelling to motivate employees. Let's dive into some of the examples that you have of B2B storytelling that really either saved the day or made a huge difference from a organizational standpoint, from a marketing standpoint.
Well, a lot of charismatic CMOs have come around and turned around a company, and that's had a lingering effect on the brand image and so on. Lou Gerstner is an example. In the early 90s, he came into IBM, which was then a failing company. They were going to break it up into 6 different companies and walk away from their heritage. And he did a lot of things. It's a wonderful story. It's in his book. And he got rid of a lot of the silos. He broke down the silos. He created a performance-based reward if you were able to help some other silo rather than the one you were in. He had he did market research that proved that people wanted IBM to be an integrated company that would solve problems, and they didn't want to go to 6 different companies in order to have their situation resolved. And he created a advertising program where he had one company, namely Ogilvy, that replaced 56 different other companies. And he did these really dramatic things, and over a period of 2 or 3 years, he really brought IBM back. And that story is still told and retold, and it forms a substantive and cultural basis for the whole concept of looking at or being able to look at a customer's total problem.
It's funny. I remember, I think it was the title of the book or something like Making an Elephant Dance or something like that. And that was such a vivid, you talk about storytelling and the metaphor of making an elephant dance. It's interesting. IBM has certainly, had great marketing over the years, and is, sort of really in an interesting position now. I mean, they've been up and down, and there's a lot of talk about Watson. Do you have a perspective on that story, and is that a story, a signature story for them today? We haven't talked about signature story, but there you are.
Yeah, I think that another source of stories for a B2B firm is the founder. If they're blessed with somebody like Watson that came into IBM in, I think, 40s and 50s and made the company a computer company, and so that sort of heritage that is sort of tied now to the Watson computer capability, the big data capability, and it gives it not only an aura of credibility because it reminds you of this rich heritage of IBM, but it also gives you some sort of almost an emotional connection that's based on this wonderful, successful, charismatic person, and so that story, it not only internally but I think among customers, is in the back of their mind when they think about Watson.
So one of the interesting things that I've seen in B2B marketing is that even for brands that are inspired enough to have a brand story on a marketing level, they may have this advertising campaign or content, and somehow it holds together from one story standpoint. The minute they get down to, say, marketing automation, programmatic media, account-based marketing, the story goes away. And it's just about optimized, this blue picture works better than that red picture, or this headline worked better than that headline. Story is gone. Do you have an opinion on that over as a sort of mechanism and, issue with story?
Well, yeah, I think that it's sort of, it's if you have a hammer, then you look for nails kind of thing. I mean, if you're somebody that's into sort of fine-tuning the presentation, then that's what you do. And if you're in the business of communicating facts, that's what you do. And so you end up improving the results, 10%, 20%, 30%, when if you had a great story, you could do it by 200% or 300%. And
so let's step back then. Let's step back, and you use the term in your book, the signature story. And how does a brand find their signature story?
Well, if you're a B2B company, there's a lot of places. We've talked about founders, we've talked about transformational CEOs, but the most common and most direct and fruitful and on-target source is customers. Customer success stories. They've applied our product or applied our service, and they came out of it. And in my company, Profit has 70 of them, and some of them are just really spectacular. The T-Mobile uncarrier decision that just transformed a whole industry that was stagnant and had all these programs and policies that customers hated. And so that story for Profit really tells something about their interest and capability you couldn't ever do by talking about programs.
And I look at Uncarrier as a big idea. It's a big idea. It's a transformational idea because you're basically, everybody else in the category is this, we're this. And so it's differentiated and it's unique. Someone, a CMO is going to listen to that and say, well, that's an ad campaign. What's the story that, from your standpoint, as you define a story, how is that storytelling?
Well, I think that that one of the things we strive for is to be authentic. I say a signature story has to be intriguing, authentic, and involving. And a story is not authentic if people say that, it's phony, it's contrived. I mean, they're just trying to sell something. But if they say things like, I can understand why you want me to learn about this story because it displays your capability, but why should I don't see why I should be interested. And if you get that reaction, you don't have authenticity. So authenticity comes when the story is so involving, intriguing, and so on that you don't think about it in that light. You just get involved, you get absorbed by the story itself. And you don't counter argue. You're not skeptical. You're just into the story.
Right. And I think that was one of the points that you made on Alan's show was that, that a story is inarguable. And I love that notion, because you can't argue with non-facts.
Right.
Right. In a sense. It's tricky. It's funny. I'm going to fake news because we're talking about if it isn't fact-based and it's emotion-based, it sounds really fluffy.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make, authentic means that, yes, someone had this experience, right? So it was real in that sense. So I don't know. I'm just sort of struggling, and I can imagine my listeners are going, okay.
Well, I had a friend, Bill Wells, who was at Needham, who used to say that what you want is verisimilitude. That is the appearance of reality. If cows could fly, that's the way they look. And when you see a cartoon about cows flying, if it's done right, you don't say cows can't fly. You just go with the story. Right. And so, but one of the problems in a B2B space is how do you make the story really intriguing? And because in a B2C space, you can often have emotion and tension and these amazing characters, but in a B2B space, and you talk about customer stories, they're usually more, oriented toward functional benefits and so on. So what do you do? And what I say is that you really have to magnify either the problem, the solution, or the outcome. So you talk about the Lou Gerstner story, for example. You have this failing company, this huge company that was just failing. They had all these silos that had taken over, and they couldn't deliver a integrated solution anymore. And you see that problem, and you say, "Wow, how on earth is he going to solve that thing?" So that gets you in.
Okay, so I think that's a perfect place to take a break. When we come back, I think problem, solution, or outcome is really an interesting framework, and we're going to dive into that in just a second.
Hey, it's Drew. I wanted to use this break to ask you a single question. Are you a courageous marketer? Do you have the courage to go to your board of directors and say, marketing could drive the growth of this company. We just need 3 times the budget. Do you have the courage to take the big idea that you already have and extend it internally and externally through influencers, through the media, through all of your content? If you're a courageous marketer but aren't sure how to roadmap all of this, I have a big idea for you. It's called Renegade Thinking. It's a program that we've developed and work with exclusively for B2B marketers, generally at large companies. And I want to give you my cell phone, 917-679-8852. Just text Renegade Thinking to 917-679-8852, and we can talk about how you can cut through.
Okay, we're back, and my guest is still David Aaker, Vice Chair of Profit. And we've been talking about storytelling, and it's interesting. We just sort of moved into the territory of what I hope will be some real actionable items that you all can take away and take back to your organization. We talked about sort of as you approach story, you're either doing it from a problem, a solution, or an outcome. But what's interesting to me, and I hear this a lot from marketers, is getting case histories that would be the basis of a story, which would be very much about outcomes, right, is very hard. I mean, the one solution I've seen some companies successfully do it is that they build it into the contract and say, by the way, we depend on this word of mouth, and therefore we're going to give you a discount, but you're going to give us permission to talk about your case. That's one way that they've gotten cases. But there's still the issue that often these cases are kind of boring.
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the problems is that customers are sometimes sensitive. They're uncomfortable with giving you details. They're uncomfortable with having you publish their quantitative outcomes. They're uncomfortable with you magnifying the problems because they're a little embarrassed about that. And so as a result of that, you end up watering down the story, and it becomes one of these stories where the audience member says, why should I be interested in that? I mean, there's sort of no longer nothing there. Starts to read like an advertisement. And so what you want to do is to punch up those areas. And, like the Lou Gerstner story, that was certainly really a problem that was magnified. And the case of T-Mobile for my company Profit, that was a solution that was so dramatically creative and so bold that it really hits you. And then you have outcome. In the T-Mobile, we had some data. I mean, how many they were declining in users, and all of a sudden they're growing more than anybody. And so those are dramatic numbers. Barclay Bank was at one point in 2012 was the least trusted brand in the least trusted industry, and they created some stories that really moved the needle. And here we have an interesting experiment, a very rare experiment, where they tried a fact-based normal advertising campaign that did nothing, and they tried a story-based campaign around some programs that involve their new, more of a higher purpose, and all these numbers, trust went up 35%, and other like numbers went up from 35 to 50%. Numbers that had not moved under the fact-based campaign. So when you see dramatic numbers like that are quantitative and based on real evidence, then you can, you can stimulate people to view these stories as intriguing, get into them.
As I'm hearing you talk, a couple of things come to mind. One is one difference between a story and not a story is, and I read this somewhere, but when you just list the facts, that's a diary, right? That's a big difference. A diary is something that, you write yourself, you read it at home, it's fine, it reminds you of what happened. It's not a story. And brands, most marketing is diary driven. The second thing that occurred to me as you were talking about brands not wanting to share the details of your customers not wanting to share the details in a B2B thing, it's one of the arguments for having a big, bold, unique brand. Because if you have a lot of cool factor and interest factor and momentum and you're tech forward, I mean, H&R Block wanted to borrow the equity of IBM Watson because they didn't have any of the cool tech. And so if you are a brand that wants to have case studies from your customers, you need to be a brand that other brands want to associate with. And it's just an interesting sort of...
Yeah, I did a lot of work with brand vision, of course, and these companies will develop this brilliant brand vision. And a brand vision is by definition what you want people to think of you, and they don't want to disclose it. It's sort of a secret strategy or something. And I've never understood that. I just think it's incongruous.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. We talked about, you mentioned the experiment and that Barclays did, and I thought that was such a great point. I'll circle back that in my summary. I'm curious, as we're sort of wrapping this episode up, are there some very specific steps that, let's say that we're a B2B brand, we're not using storytelling, we're starting from scratch. We don't know really what our story is. We don't have a founder story, so we can't go there. Problem, solution, outcome, we're in a very competitive marketplace. Everybody's sort of saying the same thing. How are they, these brands finding the story other than hiring firms like yours and mine?
Well, I think that there has to be they have to get belief that stories work.
Okay.
And that's really fundamental. And so one way to do that is to either find a situation in your firm or in some other firm that stories did work, to try to get some proof points. But I think there's a couple other organizational things that need to be done. You need to motivate people to identify and to use stories, and so you have to develop kind of a story driven culture where stories are something you do look for. The stories are something you do use, and you got to give people an incentive to tee up stories. One of my examples is Mobil, when it was a standalone oil company, had leadership, partnership, and trust as its organizational values, and it did a contest and asked people to come up with stories that reflected these three things. They got over 300 entries. The winner got to go to the infield of the Indy 500. And so anyway, that was a mechanism to get some stories started. But the other thing you need to do organizationally is to have some kind of a support unit that's dedicated to supporting storytelling and maybe other content generation as well. These can be people that are reporters. A lot of companies are hiring reporters and editors and videographers and other support staff, so that when you do get a story, you have some place to go. You turn it over to this outfit that can sort of curate it and create a presentation, as well as evaluate it to see whether it is going to be a signature story in its form, or whether it could be augmented to make it so.
A couple of notes for the listeners. One of the episodes way early on in Renegade Thinkers Unite was with David Beebe, who built an amazing content machine at Marriott, where he was an ex-Hollywood guy. He brought in literally all the production capabilities and produced amazing work and got brands excited about it. And, the outcome, they could actually trace business back to the stories that they were using. So I think that's interesting.
Well, there's one other thing I should mention, and that is that actually a more common problem in most companies is that they're okay with stories, and but not necessarily great stories, but they will get these customer case histories. At Profit we have 7 of them. In other organizations, they have more. And you just get story overload. You get overwhelmed. And you have all these stories, most of which are not very impactful. So there needs to be a program to deal with this story overload.
Yeah. Yes. All right. I have some, I'm going to attempt to wrap this up. I'm going to actually bring it all together. There's several things I want to line up for you. One is you have to believe in this, obviously. You probably didn't listen to this episode if you didn't. And I want you to, in order to believe, I want you to think about one of your favorite friends and just remember the stories that they told as kids and why you like them, because we all know great storytellers. And I would encourage you all as listeners to become storytellers. And there's a great course on Audible on storytelling that I've listened to maybe 4 times.
Really?
Great courses. It's just amazing. The professor is a professional storyteller, and I highly recommend you understand what is a story and how to do it yourself. That's a great place to start. So you have to believe in storytelling. Once you do, then you have to create a culture of storytellers. Dow Bergsma, of another wonderful storytelling advocate at Georgia Pacific, believes in it strongly. He had to bring in a chief storytelling officer. He had training. He had to help them understand the storytelling was something completely different. Another thing that David mentioned, and this occurred to me as I was reading all of his blog posts, is often the stories are driven by an action of the brand. You mentioned sort of reaching out and getting folks to do, to Mobile's example of responding. You reach out to them. I was just thinking back of a brand that we worked on years ago, the Panasonic Tough Book. And the way we created stories was we did things. We ran it over with a Hummer, on live television to prove how tough it was. And what's interesting about that, the story was built into the brand. All you had to do was prove how tough it was. I think an example that you used in your book is the Blendtec, which is Will It Blend. It's another example. It's it's a thing that you do. So stories aren't always once upon a time in that sense. They're actions that you do that enable stories to rise to the surface. There is a cumulative effect of storytelling that needs to be put in place. One of the things that I've seen, and I just want to remind you all, is I want you to throw your frickin' content calendars away. Content calendars lead to crappy content because we need content for Monday. You don't need all that content. You need good stories, and you have to have a standard for those stories. And if you don't have a standard for your stories, then you're just going to put out diary posts that aren't going to get the job done. So that's why you need to hire these editors, internally or externally, who will say, this is a story. And I think the litmus test is, would you share it with the CEO? Would you share it with your best customer? Do you really, is it something that you're proud of? Because all of this content that you're pushing out there is doing nothing for you, even if it's, quote, storytelling. So that's a lot of preaching. But David, I wonder if you have any parting thoughts, words of inspiration for our listeners.
Well, to get a really great story is magic. It's something, and I also think you should sort of look at role models and sort of be sensitive to that. When you see a really great story, and just think about, what if they tried to change perceptions, to create energy, to create visibility, and they did it with facts? It just wouldn't work.
It wouldn't. All right. Well, David, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. We look forward to seeing you, to reading your book. Again, the title of the book is
Creating Signature Stories.
Right. Which is your mission, hang up and say, when you're done listening, so write down and say, this is our signature story, or what is our signature story? So, as always, thank you for listening. Love the feedback that we're getting on the show. Be sure to share it with your friends. That's one way that you can thank.
So I have one final comment.
Oh, another comment.
Yeah, and that is that signature stories can also be used to create or to help you fine-tune organizational values and a brand vision. So what you do is, if you're in a room with that task in mind, you ask the group, what are some signature stories about this firm? Some things that reflect what we do and what we really believe in. And then it's amazing, because that will lead you into a discussion of organizational values that will have a lot more context and depth and creativity than you otherwise would have.
Great. All right. Well, that's a great place for to wrap up. Thank you again for being on the show, and to all you listeners, keep those Renegade thinking caps on and strong.
This has been Renegade Thinkers Unite, but it doesn't end there. Just go to renegadethinkersunite.com for more and subscribe to the show. That way, you'll never miss an episode. We'll talk with you next time on Renegade Thinkers Unite.